Shortly before I started making this program, news came in of the sudden death in prison of the Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny. The first thing to say about that event is that it is a tragedy for Navalny himself and, of course, for his family, his wife and his children. And it's slightly concerning to me that after this moment in time, few people seem to be remembering that fact. Now, as to the cause of Navalny's death, I'm going to say straight away that I have a completely open mind. Already, and entirely unsurprisingly, there has been a rush from various commentators, from people on Twitter, from people who write about the news in the media, to attribute the death to President Putin, to the Russian authorities, to allege that Navalny was in fact murdered by them. I prefer to wait a little until the dust settles and we get a little bit more information before stating my own view. Though I should say that though I understand an investigation into his death is going to take place, the Russian authorities have organized it, a commission of inquiry has been sent to the prison, and no doubt there will be an autopsy. I doubt that the result of the autopsy is going to change what are already firmly held opinions. The one further thing about Navalny's death I am going to say, however, is this. For a very brief time, basically in 2013, when he stood for mayor of Moscow, Navalny did cut through to a part of the electorate in Moscow, and he did win a significant number of votes in an election in Moscow for the post of mayor. It's important to say, however, that even in that election, he was heavily outpolled by his opponent Sergei Sobyanin, and most people who follow that poll closely, which took place, by the way, in the context of a very low turnout, agree that Sobyanin did in fact win. And that was the high point of Navalny's popularity. Since then, it seems to me that his support, his public support in Russia has steadily declined, and I think that in the last few years, even before he was sent to prison, it had, to all intents and purposes, essentially collapsed. So, in terms of Russian politics, I generally don't think that his death is going to make any great difference. In the West, it is otherwise. The claim that Navalny was murdered by the Russian authorities, whether true or not, is going to be believed by a large number of people. It is going to consolidate the already widely prevalent belief that President Putin runs a murderous government. Whilst that's not going to change anything in the immediate term, given the collapse of relations between Russia and the West, it could be that if, say, a new president is elected to office in the United States who wants to take steps to improve relations with Russia, the death of Navalny is something which people who oppose that will bring up and which will make any attempt to try to achieve a rapprochement between the West and Russia and between the United States and Russia still more difficult than it already is. There's a second point I also want to make, and I think it partly accounts for some of the real anger and anguish in the West, in some of these commentaries that have appeared in the West about Navalny's death, which I, for one, see, which is that very mistakenly, in my opinion, many commentators in the West, many government officials in the West, have persuaded themselves that Navalny has had much more support and popularity in Russia than he ever really did. They truly believe, some of them, that he is in fact a potential, or was a potential challenger to President Putin, and that he might one day become even Russia's leader and change Russia's direction and bring it back, in effect, into the West's orbit. I think that was a fantastical idea. I don't think that there was ever the slightest possibility of it. But I remember way back before the last presidential election in the United States, in a former head of the CIA writing on Twitter that he could imagine a situation where President Biden might come to a deal with President Navalny, and, well, perhaps he was only a dreamer, but who knows, his dream might come true. It was, in fact, a tweet which, as I remember, drew some language from John Lennon's ballad, Imagine, which I have to say I found completely bizarre. Well, as I said, there was never any prospect of a President Navalny of Russia ever appearing, but many people in the West wanted to believe that there was. And the problem they now have is that with Navalny dead, there is no one convincingly who even Western political leaders and commentators can convincingly imagine taking his place. And that, in effect, leads them to a position which they don't want to be in, which is recognizing that the only political leader who is leading Russia and who is likely to lead Russia for the foreseeable future is none other than the current president, Vladimir Putin, and that there is no actual challenge to him, real or notional. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Navalny's death. It is a tragedy, as I said, for himself and for his family. But in terms of genuine political effect in Russia, well, there might be a few scattered protests, but I don't think it will have any which matter. Now, I've discussed Navalny. I'm now going to come back to the more substantive issues which I want to discuss in this program. And despite my continuing wish to talk about the situation in the Middle East, I find myself again obliged to devote the entirety of this program to the situation in Ukraine, where things continue to take an incredibly dramatic turn. And the place to start is with the situation in Avdeyevka. Now, in my program yesterday, I spoke about how the situation in Avdeyevka was rapidly collapsing, how it looked as if Ukrainian troops in the air defense base and the Cherubasha complex just to the north of it had been cut off. It looked as if the filtration plant might also have fallen under Russian control. It looked as if the air defense base and the Cherubasha complex had indeed fallen under Russian control. And it also seemed as if most of the Ukrainian troops in the center of Avdeyevka, in the southern and central parts of Avdeyevka, were now caught between the Russian pincers and were effectively cut off, and that one got the sense of an utterly chaotic and collapsing situation. Well, the news has continued to pour in, and the first thing to say about the news is that all the claims that have been made over the last week or so about the very furthest extent of Russian advances have now turned out to be true. There were some people who were wondering whether it was possible for the Russians to advance as far and as fast as they appeared to be doing, but it turns out that they were. It's now absolutely uncontested that they have cut the main supply road, that they pushed, in fact, well beyond the main supply road. This is in the central part of Avdeyevka. It is also uncontested that the Russians have pushed north at this point and have captured a small cafe complex, which was also seen as some kind of possible Ukrainian fortified position. I remember when, about 3 days ago, it was first said that the Russians were pushing towards this cafe complex. There were doubts that this could possibly be the case, given the distance of this cafe complex from the verified positions that the Russians were occupying at that time. Well, they have pushed all the way to that cafe complex. They've raised their flag there. There are pictures of this. It is undisputed. They've also established control of an area near a kind of yellow column or stela. This was a feature close to the place which President Zelensky, in the trip to Avdeyevka, he apparently made about a month ago. Anyway, it's essentially that location which the Russians have now captured. And at the same time, there are other reports which confirm now beyond any question that the air defense complex and the Cherubasha complex have indeed been captured by the Russians. It seems that the Russians also can now control a district called Vinogradsky, which is just north of these two complexes. It seems the Ukrainians have definitely abandoned the filtration plant and that the Russians have captured it. And we've had a very distressing account of the fighting in the air defense complex from a Ukrainian soldier who was there. He appears to have posted it on a Telegram channel or on Twitter X. I haven't read it myself. It's in Ukrainian, but we've now had many references and translations of it. This soldier says, that after the troops were cut off, they made an attempt to escape. They found that all the escape routes had been blocked. The fields were filled with the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers trying to escape this filtration plant, this air defense base, who were then attacked by Russian drones, artillery, whatever. He says that as they tried to escape from this area, from the air defense base and the Cheburasha complex. A second group of soldiers tried to take a different route. Only a small number of them were able to escape. And most of the others got cut off in the Vinogradsky complex. And the implication is that they're now being rounded up by the Russians there. There's also reports of mass surrenders of Ukrainian troops who had been defending the air defense base and the Cheburashka complex. As I have said already, I find it incomprehensible that those troops, those Ukrainian troops who were still in these two complexes, were allowed to remain there long after it had become clear that they were at very high risk of being cut off. Anyway, this was a very, very distressing story, but it is not by any means the worst of the stories that are now starting to pour out, and they're coming from Ukrainian sources as well. Because the reports suggest that there is now general panic amongst Ukrainian troops, still in Avdeyevka, that many of them have been trying to flee Avdeyevka across the fields and the country roads, trying to escape, that they've been caught in the open by Russian artillery and Russian machine gunners, but most devastating of all, by Russian aircraft, that again, there have been massive bomb strikes on these fleeing soldiers, that large numbers of them have been killed, and that in fact, most of these fleeing soldiers are either killed or they've been obliged to return to Avdeyevka, where they are in effect cut off. And there are also reports that, far from slackening in their attacks on Avdeyevka against increasingly disorganized and chaotic resistance, the Russians, on the contrary, are intensifying their attacks. They seem to be pushing westwards towards a further village to the west of Avdeyevka. This is the village where supposedly the Azov Brigade, the 3rd Assault Brigade as it now calls itself, has its main headquarters. It looks like we're likely to see an encounter battle for this particular village, with the Russian Air Force bombing this village heavily. There's also reports that the Russians are sending forces south to try to cut off some of these country roads. This is from the center of Avdeyevka. And we are still getting reports of a pending Russian armored advance towards the so-called citadel, the 9th quarter, the area of the high rises, the area also sometimes called as Khimik. It has been heavily bombed. These buildings now are basically skeletons. They're just facades of buildings. But anyway, there's reports that the Russians are preparing to storm this area, and there are even some reports that they've already reached it and that they might be occupying some of the buildings in this area as well. Anyway, lots of reports now of large numbers, thousands of Ukrainian troops cut off in various parts of Avdeyevka. There are confusing reports about how many. Some put it as 3,500. I've seen others say that it's as many as 7,000. It is, I think the word rout is not too strong to describe the situation, based, of course, entirely on the reports I am seeing. And it's equally clear to me that the Ukrainians have no coherent response to this situation. Meanwhile, the British still talking about the 3rd Assault Brigade, the former Azov Brigade, coming to the rescue, despite the fact that clearly that operation has already failed. I ought to say that there are some claims that the men of the 3rd Assault Brigade, the Azov fighters, perhaps the single most motivated group of fighters in the Ukrainian armed forces, have refused orders to advance into Avdeyevka. They realized that doing so would be, in effect, suicide. Anyway, I'm not going to debate this. There was even a claim yesterday that up to 600 soldiers of the 3rd Assault Brigade, the equivalent of an entire battalion, have been killed or wounded in the existing fighting. Again, this is a figure. It is impossible to verify. Anyway, there are reports that these troops refused to move into Avdeyevka. They're, as I said, still apparently located. What remains of this brigade is still apparently located in this village to the west of Avdeyevka, which the Russians are now bombing and attacking. But anyway, the British assumption that the situation can still be retrieved in some way. I think anybody who observes the situation closely can see clearly that this is not the case. And Admiral Kirby, the spokesman of the US National Security Council, by contrast, gave a much more realistic account of the situation in Avdeyevka. It was difficult, by the way, not to note a certain note of panic in his words. But anyway, Kirby also seemed to accept that Avdeyevka, the defense of Avdeyevka, was about to collapse. And of course, he was careful to blame this on the lack of ammunition, with the implication that this entire situation has been caused by Republican obstruction in Congress. I'm going to return to that topic shortly in this program. And perhaps following on from Admiral Kirby's panicky words, we've had a statement from President Biden himself saying that the betrayal of Ukraine would never be forgiven. Again, that references Congress. That seems to also have been triggered by the events in Avdeyevka. It perhaps also reflects his own alarm that the entire situation in Ukraine is now heading for some kind of collapse. And of course, again, it is clearly an attempt to blame the Republicans in Congress for this general unraveling. So that's the situation as far as I can see in Avdeyevka. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, they continue to be bombed, attacked by Russian forces. This is not a situation such as we have seen in other cauldrons where the Russians encircle the Ukrainian troops and basically wait for these troops to capitulate and surrender, as happened when in the Battle of Mariupol, when the Ukrainians withdrew under the Azovstal factory, and the Russians basically waited them out. Well, this isn't like that at all. The Russians, on the contrary, are continuing their assaults right across Avdeyevka, and, as I said, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers apparently lacking a clear sense of what to do and perhaps a clear sense of command. are resisting as best they can in most cases. In some cases, perhaps they're now starting to surrender, but the whole situation is becoming disorganized and chaotic, and it looks as if there will be a collapse with probably thousands of prisoners falling into Russian hands. So that's it. That's the situation in Avdeyevka. And there is a fundamental point to be made about this battle. Firstly, it has evolved at a much greater speed than I think most people expected when the Russians first began their advance on Avdeyevka in October. And there are multiple reasons for this. The first reason is that the Russians are much stronger than they have been at any previous point in this war. Russian forces are far better equipped. They appear to be more numerous. If it is indeed the case that 50,000 Russian troops are involved in the attack on Avdeyevka, as the Ukrainians are now claiming, that is a very significant force indeed to capture this one objective. And the Russians seem to have an abundance, not just of artillery, as they've had in previous sieges, but of drones, of jamming equipment, of aircraft, of every conceivable weapon in any military's arsenal. And they've been able to bring it to bear, and they've used it with very great tactical skill. But even as the Russians are now much stronger, it's clear that the Ukrainians are much weaker than they have been in previous battles. It's clear that the unit that for far too long bore the burden of trying to defend Avdeyevka, the 110th Mechanized Brigade, had become severely depleted and exhausted by being on the front lines for the better part of 2 years throughout the start of the special military operation. It's clear that Ukrainian units deployed to Avdeyevka and to the areas surrounding it, many of them were under strength. It's also clear that Ukraine is indeed suffering from a crisis in artillery, that there are desperate shortages of shells, that Ukraine is incapable of countering the Russian artillery in the way that they have been able to do in earlier periods in the war. But it is also clear that the Ukrainian command has been disorganized. It's likely that the prolonged power struggle between General Zelensky and President Zelensky, to some extent, at least, complicated and paralyzed decision-making, which made it impossible for Ukrainian commanders in Avdeyevka to make the obvious decisions to pull back, which they needed to make. And all the indications are that this chaos, this command chaos, continues. Now, all of this is important because in the past, the Russians have gained significant victories. They captured Lysychansk, for example, in the summer of 2022. They captured Mariupol earlier in 2022. And last year, in May 2023, they captured Bakhmut. And these were important victories, and victories which potentially could have significantly weakened, did significantly weaken the position of Ukrainian forces. But at that time, the Russians were nowhere near as strong as they are now. And they failed to exploit to the fullest degree the victories that they had achieved. If we go back a year ago, they did not advance beyond Bakhmut after they captured Bakhmut. They did not, at that time, capture villages like Khromovo, Bogdanovka, and Ivanivska, even though Ukrainian defenses were weak and disorganized. And this was because the Russians, their own forces had become tired and depleted. And of course, in the case of the Battle of Bakhmut, there was the added complication of the bitter feud between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization, and the Russian Defense Ministry, which caused the Wagner forces to be withdrawn from the Bakhmut area, perhaps prematurely. So the Russians last year did not gain the full fruit of their victory because they were depleted and disorganized, and that gave the Ukrainians time to find their footing, and in the case of Bakhmut, go back on the attack. A year earlier, after the fall of Lysychansk, the situation arguably was graver for the Ukrainians still. I will remember the situation after Lysychansk fell. Ukrainian defenses were indeed deeply depleted and disorganized at that time. There was widespread expectations that having captured Lysychansk, the Russians would be able to move forward purposefully, capture the town of Siversk. They successfully captured a town called Belogorodka. They'd already captured Liman. It looked as if the Russians would be able to capitalize on their victory in Lysychansk and press forward and lay siege to Slavyansk itself. It didn't happen, and again the reason was that the Russian forces by this point had become severely depleted. There'd obviously been personnel losses in the fighting in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, but on top of that, many of the contract soldiers who had joined the Russian military, their contracts were expiring and they were choosing en masse to return to civilian life. And the Russian army simply lacked the necessary strength to continue the offensive and to capitalize on the gains which had been achieved. That is not the situation now. The Russian military has grown immeasurably stronger since this time last year. The Ukrainian military has grown weaker, and all the indications are that once the Battle of Avdeyevka has ended, the Russians will push forward further. So, an unfolding catastrophe, and of course, if it is indeed the case, as seems at the moment, not just very likely, but almost certain, that all of these Ukrainian soldiers in Avdeyevka, now apparently cut off, will be left with no option but to surrender, and that we get large surrenders en masse, then the psychological blow of all of this for Ukraine will be tremendous. So, that is the Battle of Avdeyevka. It's important to say that Russian pressure continues all along the front line. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has given us a further update of the military situation in Ukraine, and as it regularly does on a Friday, it's given us an update of the military situation over the past week. And it says that Ukrainian losses over the past week, it gives a figure for Ukrainian losses over the past week, dead and wounded, of 5,500. This is less than it was the week before, when it was more than 6,000. It's about the same level as it was in the first week of February, when it was also around 5,000. It is important again to remember that this does not include, these figures do not include Ukrainian losses in Avdeyevka, which look like they are going to be enormous. So already, even leaving out Avdeyevka, just over the last 3 weeks, according to Russian estimates, Ukraine has lost somewhere in the region of 17,000 men, dead and severely wounded. Now, again, you can argue with these Russian figures, many people will, but for the record, once one allows for the fact that the Russians are giving figures for dead and wounded, I think that they're roughly correct. They seem, as I've said before, to match up very closely with the information we're getting from Ukraine. And the Russians have also now provided an explanation of their big missile strike of a few days ago, the one that struck Kiev and other places. From what I can tell, around 30 missiles were launched. The Russians say this: in the period from 11th to 16th February, the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered 30 group strikes by long-range precision weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles at facilities of Ukrainian military-industrial complex producing and repairing aircraft engines, radio electronic equipment, and ammunition. Moreover, strikes were delivered at factories producing fuel and lubricants for the Ukrainian military, warehouses of military and technical equipment, as well as deployment points of Ukrainian units and nationalist formations. Now, the Ukrainians, as I've said previously, are saying that they were only able to shoot down around half of the missiles that the Russians launched against them. And it does seem, actually, as if, as I've said before in previous programs, the Ukrainian air defense system is in itself now in the process of collapse. And we've had reports coming from the United States that by mid-March, in other words, a month from now, Ukraine will be critically short of air defense missiles. But I just want to come back to this report from the Russian Defense Ministry, because it says that amongst the places which the Russians launched their missile strikes against were deployment points of Ukrainian units and nationalist formations. I suspect that this is an elliptical reference to the missile strike on Selidovo, the training complex at Selidovo, which took place a few days ago. This was where the Azov Brigade was supposed to have been concentrated. The Russians supposedly launched a missile strike against this complex. There have been many reports and pictures now of an attack on this complex. The Ukrainians have tried to cast doubt on the claim that this missile strike did take place. I think this Russian report indirectly confirms that it did. The Russian Defense Ministry doesn't want to discuss what happened at Selidovo. They don't want to give more precise information because it is connected with the fighting in Avdeyevka, and the Russians don't want to say anything about the fighting in Avdeyevka for the time being. And as to the reasons, by the way, why the Russians do not want to say anything about the fighting in Avdeyevka, I suspect that this is another product of the Prigozhin affair. During the fighting in Bakhmut last year, Prigozhin was giving us a running commentary, in effect, of Russian advances, or Wagner force advances in Bakhmut. This was very much contrary to the tradition of the Russian military. I think it annoyed the Russian Defense Ministry and the General Staff, and they decided that the next time there was a battle that bore any resemblance to Bakhmut at all, this time they would say as little about it as possible, and in fact, best of all, not at all. Anyway, there we are. I think we have, from the Russians, indirect confirmation now that the strike on Selidovo took place. The fact that it talks about deployment points of Ukrainian units and nationalist formations, to my mind, puts the question all but beyond doubt. The one thing I would say is that I suspect that the claims that hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers were killed and thousands wounded in that strike are definitely exaggerated. I saw a Ukrainian claim that Ukrainian losses in the strike at Selidovo were around 200 men, and I think that is much more plausible, actually. So, a collapse in Avdeyevka, Russian advances all across the front line, and today the Russian Defense Ministry published a detailed report, surprisingly detailed report, about the fighting in Novo-Mikhailovka. They published footage of assault actions of units of the 155th Separate Guards Brigade, of the Order of Zhukov, of the Pacific Fleet Marines Brigade, assaulting Ukrainian positions in the southern Donetsk direction. And it then goes on to say that as a result of the offensive action of these soldiers, the Russians have significantly improved their positions along the front line near Novo-Mikhailovka, and during the offensive, Marines moved stealthily to the line of contact and storm enemy positions located in dilapidated buildings and homes abandoned by civilians. With the support of artillery and ground aviation, the servicemen attacked the enemy simultaneously from several directions and methodically move forward. So that's a Russian account of the fighting from the Defense Ministry of the fighting in Novo-Mikhailovka. This is this village to the south of Marinka. The fact that the Russian Defense Ministry is publishing information like this about the fighting in Novo-Mikhailovka strongly suggests to me that the Russians are now confident that this village is going to be captured at some point within the next few days. There are reports that the Russians are also in the process now of surrounding and storming the village of Pobieda, also in the Marinka sector, not far from Novo-Mikhailovka. But perhaps the most dramatic news, apart from the very dramatic news, comes from the Bakhmut area, where, as I said, the Russians seem to be well on the way now to storming Ivanivska. It's likely that that village will also fall as well. That will roll up Ukrainian defenses southwest of Bakhmut, and it will open the way for an attack on Chasov Yar, with the village of Bogdanovka to the northwest of Bakhmut also likely to be collapsing as well. And these are just some places where the Russians are attacking. There continue to be widespread rumors of a major Russian offensive beginning in the southern Zaporozhye battlefields. And there are also continuing reports that the Ukrainians have now completely abandoned Krinky, the bridgehead that they established on the east bank of the Dnieper River. That battle has ended. So, a disaster, an developing disaster on the battlefronts for Ukraine. They've been defeated in Avdeyevka, and they have been defeated by a Russian army that is now becoming much stronger than it has ever been, even as they are becoming increasingly weaker. Well, what do the Ukrainians do? Well, if we ask President Zelensky, who is, of course, the president of Ukraine, he has, of course, left Kiev. He is now in Germany. I saw pictures of him in Berlin, where he had a meeting with Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Reports say that he's going to go to Munich to participate in the Munich Security Conference, given that it was the Munich Security Conference in 2022. And the bizarre and extraordinary speeches that I heard from President Zelensky himself and Western leaders who participated in that conference, which in my opinion set the stage for the unfolding disaster, which is the war in Ukraine. I would have thought that he'd want to stay away from a rerun of the Munich Security Conference. And besides, with this disaster on the battlefronts, I would have thought that his proper role was to remain in Kiev and to try to bring some order to the engulfing chaos. But instead, Zelensky has chosen to go to Germany, to Munich and Berlin. Well, there we go. That's what he intends to do. He apparently also intends to go on to France, where he's going to meet with President Macron and sign the security agreement with France that Macron declined to come to Kiev to sign. I discussed the extraordinary rumours that are circulating around that. Anyway, that's what President Zelensky is doing. What do the Ukrainian military commanders do? There's a report that General Syrskyi has gone around asking the political leaders in Kiev some of the same questions that General Zelensky asked. Where is the ammunition? Where are the reinforcements? Where are the reserves? What are we expected to fight with? Is there going to be relief for Ukraine from the United States? Well, Speaker Johnson has categorically refused to put the draft Senate bill authorizing funding for Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel before the House. He says that it makes absolutely no sense for the United States to be authorizing these large sums of money unless and until some resolution is made to the problem of the border. And it's perhaps there's some justification for this position, because it was, after all, President Biden who, when he first put forward this appropriations bill to gain funding for Ukraine, tacked all of these various things together, funding for Israel, funding for Taiwan, and funding for the border. And now that that's not worked, he's turned around and said that it shouldn't be done this way. As I said already, I think it was a major mistake, in fact, to do it this way. But anyway, that is what Biden has done. And in a sense, he's caught on his own mistake. Now, there are moves, apparently, in Congress to try to override Speaker Johnson's decision. As I've said many times, I'm not an expert on parliamentary manoeuvres in Washington. I'm not going to try and speculate about these. It may be that there are enough Republicans who can be peeled away to support whatever motion the Democrats cobble together, though most commentators seem to think that is unlikely. But regardless, the House of Representatives has risen until the 28th of February, so we would have about 2 weeks over the course of which this bill cannot move forward, whatever manoeuvres now take place. The European Union, or rather the European countries, have come together. There's been another meeting in Ramstein, and I want to stress it is the Europeans now, because without funding from the United States, without authorization from the United States isn't able to do very much. Anyway, the Europeans have come together in Ramstein. They said that they will form a coalition, an air defense coalition, to help Ukraine with air defense. I find this very surprising because I seem to remember that such a coalition was actually set up a year ago. So it seems to me that they are saying that they're going to do all over again that which they already said they were going to do last year. And if Ukraine is short of air defense missiles now, given the well-established problems with Ukraine's air defense industries, rather with Europe's air defense industries, well, realistically, how are they going to get enough missiles, air defense missiles in Ukraine to make a difference and to change the course of the situation? The Europeans are also talking about providing Ukraine with 1 million drones. Well, that sounds like a lot of drones, except, of course, if one actually looks at the numbers of drones that have been deployed in this conflict. It actually isn't. 1 million drones is probably dwarfed by the number of drones that the Russians are already producing. Importantly, the Europeans seem to have given up on the idea of trying to provide the Ukrainians with significant numbers of shells, at least in the short term. They still say that they're going to provide Ukraine with 1.4 million shells, but I don't think anybody takes that seriously anymore. So there's not going to be relief for the Ukrainians from the United States and from the West. Zelensky may be asking, where are all the men? Where is the ammunition? Where is the equipment? But to all appearances, it doesn't exist. Now, yesterday in my program, I discussed a comment provided by one of the regular people who emails me, a person with a military background who has been immensely helpful to me many times. He suggested that the only thing that the Ukrainians realistically can do is to withdraw beyond the Dnieper River, try to fortify their front lines in the north, use the Dnieper as a barrier, and in the meantime, open negotiations with the Russians right away in order to try to find some way out, some mechanism for peace. This person, by the way, has contacted me again since I did that program, and he has confirmed that I discussed his thoughts accurately. Well, I've now had a further email from another person equally, well, perhaps even, well, at least equally versed in military matters. Somebody who's provided me also, in fact, with a huge amount of invaluable assistance, and who has been, by the way, also a very useful source of information about many things. Anyway, he's come back, and he said that the whole idea of withdrawing beyond the Dnieper would be disastrous. It would mean abandoning the whole of eastern Ukraine. It would be all but impossible to do in an effective way. And the Dnieper is not an effective barrier. That Ukraine has struggled, as we've seen in Krinky, to establish a foothold beyond the Dnieper. But the Russians, if they put their mind to it, would have no difficulty advancing beyond the Dnieper and essentially giving up the most productive part, economically productive part of Ukraine, which is the entirety of Ukraine, beyond the Dnieper, would be a catastrophic decision. Now, I think this person is right, but I'm also going to say that I think that these two perspectives are not completely in contradiction to each other, because the first commentator actually acknowledges that the Russians would eventually be able to cross the Dnieper. He's not denying this. He says that there are no fortified lines of any significance on the east bank of the Dnieper, and trying to cobble them together on the rush with the Russian army advancing is simply impractical and will guarantee the encirclement and destruction of the entire Ukrainian army east of the Dnieper. He says, pull back beyond the Dnieper, try to save what you can, and begin negotiations. Try to get a ceasefire. Use the Dnieper as a barrier, but don't assume that it is an insuperable barrier. Begin negotiations at once. And I would add to that a point which I have made many times before, which is that the Dnieper line, the Dnieper itself, is whatever potential military barrier it may be. And by the way, I entirely accept the view that it is not ultimately an effective military barrier. I have no doubt that the Russians would be able to cross it if they put their mind to it. It cannot function, as some people appear to think it does, as a kind of state border for Ukraine. On the contrary, if you look at the economic geography of Ukraine, as I've discussed many times, the Dnieper is not a border, it is Ukraine's main artery. If you actually look at interstate borders around the world, in the vast majority of cases you will find that they do not lie along river lines. Sometimes they do, I'm not saying that they never do, but generally they don't. If you look at where most of the world's great rivers are located, they are principally located within countries, not along the borders of countries. And the reason is that rivers are transport, communications arteries and throughout history have always been so. If Ukraine cedes control of all its territory east of the Dnieper to the Russians, the Ukraine that would be left west of the Dnieper would not be economically viable except with unlimited levels of Western aid. You would have to spend trillions to turn the entire Ukrainian economy around in order to try to make up for the loss of this key artery and of the territories that lie to the east. Even then, it's likely that central Ukraine and Kiev itself would go into deep decline. Perhaps western Ukraine might conceivably flourish, but rump Ukraine as a whole would not. So let me come and repeat the point again. A retreat to the Dnieper would be a disaster if that was made a long-term defense line. And it probably wouldn't work anyway. A stand, continuing a stand on the east bank of the Dnieper would probably be a disaster as well. The only thing that Ukraine can do, realistically, in this situation, is to open negotiations with the Russians. That is the only way forward. That is the lesson that Avdeyevka teaches. That is the lesson that we have seen over the last 2 years, even with enormous levels of American military support. It has proved impossible for Ukraine to defeat Russia. And this brings me back to this discussion about the supposed betrayal of Ukraine by Congress. The United States has already poured vast sums of money into Ukraine. It has given Ukraine an absolute cornucopia of weapons. They've been provided with HIMARS missiles, with javelins and stingers, M777 howitzers, M109 self-propelled Paladin howitzers, hundreds of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 2 million shells. People tend to forget that. The United States has stripped its own stockpiles of shells down to the bare minimum in order to equip Ukraine with shells. They provided Ukraine with enormous amount of military intelligence, the spies in the skies, the satellites, all of that kind of thing. They've given huge amounts of equipment to Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine. The Europeans have done the same. And it has not made Ukraine's situation better. It has made it much worse. It meant that Ukraine, instead of accepting reality that it could not defeat Russia, was persuaded to go fighting on. It engaged in ruinously costly counteroffensives in the autumn of 2022, which cost Ukraine many lives and achieved territorial gains which are likely to prove ephemeral. It encouraged Ukraine to launch a cataclysmically misconceived offensive in the summer, which ended in outright disaster. And it has brought Ukraine to the point at which it is in now. Even if Congress ultimately passes this appropriations bill, even it would still be significantly less funding for Ukraine this year than the funding the United States provided to Ukraine in 2023 and 2022. And of course, shell supplies, tank supplies, infantry fighting vehicle supplies to Ukraine would be less because there is less to give anyway. So, this story that is being spread right across the media in the West by the Biden administration in the United States, that cutting off aid to Ukraine is a betrayal of Ukraine, is completely wrong. The betrayal of Ukraine, on the contrary, was persuading that tragic country, or rather the leadership of that tragic country, to think that it could resist Russia and to encourage it, not just since the special military operation began in February 2022, but even before then, to defy the Russians, to refuse to come to terms, both with Russia and with the internal parties who had resisted the Maidan seizure of power, revolution if you like, coup if you prefer, making Ukrainians think that victory with the West could be achieved, and holding before them the mirage of eventual NATO and even EU membership. Professor Mearsheim has spoken about how Ukraine was led up the primrose path to his own destruction. And in fact, that is exactly what has happened. And that is exactly how it is playing out. Now, we have some comments about this from President Putin. And he's made clear that he's not wholly satisfied with his interview with Tucker Carlson. There were various points that he wanted to talk about, which he didn't. He wanted to say an awful lot, for example, about how modern Russia is in no way responsible for the pogroms that used to take place in the Tsarist era. I'm not going to discuss that. Actually, rather interesting historical passage. But he makes clear again how angry he is, and how angry the Russians also are, about the way in which the West, as they see it, has led to this whole disaster. The first thing is that Putin went out of his way to say that it is completely wrong and a misrepresentation of his words that he said during Tucker Carlson's interview that the Russians launched the special military operation because they expected an imminent attack from NATO. He makes it clear that the reason he launched the special military operation was because it seemed to him and the rest of the Russian leadership in February 2022 that Ukraine, with the encouragement of the Western powers, was about to launch a military attack on Donbass in order to overrun the two Donbass republics. This is what Putin said. What served as the trigger was the current Ukrainian officials' outright refusal to comply with the Minsk agreements, coupled with Ukraine's relentless attacks on the unrecognized republics of Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, which continued for 8 years and resulted in numerous deaths. Realizing that there are no prospects of resolving this problem under the Minsk agreements, These republics formally requested our recognition. We recognized them and signed a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance. After that, as required by the UN Charter, we fulfilled our obligations under the treaty. That's what Putin says. So it was because he anticipated an attack on Donbass at that time, and that was a product of the failure to implement the Minsk agreement. Now, you may or may not agree with him about an imminent attack by Ukraine on Donbass. I think perhaps a plan for that did exist. There is no doubt that shelling was intensifying to an extraordinary degree. But about the failure to implement the Minsk agreement, there is no doubt that Putin is right. And consider what he says after. We did not initiate this war. Rather, we are striving to end it. During the first phase, we tried to achieve this through peaceful means, specifically through the Minsk agreements. However, it became apparent that we had been given the runaround once again. Both the former German Chancellor and the former President of France admitted and publicly stated that they had never intended to honour the agreements and had merely used them to buy time to supply the Ukrainian regime with more weapons, which they successfully did. Our only regret is that we did not take action sooner, believing that we were dealing with honest people. You could see how angry he is when he talks about honest people in that kind of way. He is, of course, referring specifically to Chancellor Merkel, first and foremost. He feels that he and Germany deceived him. And this is something which he blames himself for. We had been given the runaround once again. And he says that our only regret, and of course he means his only regret, is that he did not take action sooner, believing that he was dealing with honest people, which of course they were not. And that makes it most unlikely, by the way, that Putin is going to accept mediation from the West in this conflict again. And Putin was careful in this interview to say nothing about wider Russian objectives. But anyway, we can see how strongly he feels, and we can also see how strongly he feels about the Germans, because of his comments further on in the interview about the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock. At one point he pretended that he couldn't remember her surname. At another point he pretended that he didn't know how to pronounce her surname, despite the fact that he is a fluent German speaker. And he also said that she is clearly hostile to Russia, but she is also hostile to Germany as well. The German foreign minister and people like her are, of course, hostile towards Russia. In my opinion, she is also hostile towards her own country, because it is hard to imagine such a high-ranking politician treating the economic interests of her people and country with such disdain. I will not go into details, but this is exactly what is happening in reality. We can see this. Anyway, people might have doubts about this, but Putin does talk about the way in which the Russians were deceived about NATO's eastward expansion. He has much to say in the interview about this. We have been constantly deceived about NATO's non-expansion to the east, By the way, then NATO Secretary General, a representative of Germany, made such a promise. He explicitly stated NATO would not expand even an inch to the east. NATO proceeded to expand 5 times, completely deceiving us. Of course, we were concerned about the possibility of Ukraine being drawn into NATO, as it poses a threat to us. And again, he is right. He's right about the promises not to expand NATO eastwards. He is right about the sabotage of the Minsk agreement. That is the true betrayal of Ukraine. It had NATO membership dangled before it at a time when most of its people didn't want it, and it was led to think that it could simply walk away from the Minsk agreement without consequences, and it was rearmed and encouraged to think that a military solution could be found to its problems, and then when the Russians came after February 2022 and launched their special military operation, it was led to think that it could prevail against the Russians through the assistance of the West. The sooner this ends, the sooner the Ukrainians are told the West cannot help. The only solution is to talk to the Russians instead. Only at that point will the true betrayal of Ukraine end. Pretending that another $60 billion is going to change the situation is just going to extend the true betrayal of Ukraine even longer. Anyway, that's where I'm going to end my program today. I have spoken perhaps rather more emotionally than I usually do, and perhaps more emotionally than I intended, but I've been watching some of the film from Avdeyevka, and frankly, it has put me in that mood. All I'm going to say now is to wish you all a good day, to remind you again that I'll be making more programs tomorrow and further program tomorrow. No doubt the situation in Avdeyevka will be further clarified. And I just wish to remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Please don't forget to check out our shop. You can find amazing things there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.